Good day. In this day, I'd like to share with you some advice specifically for older candidates, and this is based on some recent experience I had. The first thing I'd like to talk about here is on the topic of coachability. Okay, are you coachable for the purpose of, improving your interviewing skills? Because it's a well-known fact that people who are coachable also tend to be the best performers. Okay, how do you know you're coachable? What does it mean to be coachable? What if I share with you an example? Okay, say I role play with a candidate the following interview question. Tell me about the time when you disagreed with your manager, your boss. However, you had to commit to their decision or their way of doing things. What did you do and what was the outcome? Right, so I had this event during a coaching session as of recently, and basically what the candidate said was a time when they thoroughly disagree with their boss, but they basically committed due to the fact that they're the employee, so they have to obey, even though the outcome of this was the boss had a terrible idea, and it was essentially a failure. Okay, so basically the candidate said that, hey, you know what, I'm committing because they're the boss, but even though I disagree with their decision. Okay, now this would be a bad example, a bad type of answer, simply because you're not selling yourself as an interview candidate on much other than being obedient, which isn't the main thing when you're working in a high-performing environment. And therefore, I advised that candidate, hey, you know what, you'll have to find a better answer of a time when maybe your boss had a great idea to which you were not familiar. Maybe you didn't understand, maybe you weren't sufficiently skilled to understand their way of thinking, and even though you didn't understand, you committed because they're the boss, they're the more experienced, and the outcome would have been a success story. Okay, and we agreed that this would be the best path moving forward. And then we had our second coaching session. During the second coaching session, I asked the candidate the same precise interview question. Tell me about the time when you committed to your boss's decision even though you disagreed. And the candidate gave me exactly the same answer as they did in our first session. The failure when they agreed, because they're the boss. So this brings me back to my coaching statement. People who are coachable listen. Okay, people who are coachable also learn from mistakes. They don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. People who are also coachable tend to have superior listening skills, because you do have to excel at listening skills if you want to give great answers to these interview questions, because they're rather counterintuitive to answer, right? And in case you didn't know, there's a whole industry of building listening skills for job interviews and listening skills in exchanges in general, right? So the first topic was on coachability. This is super important to understand and to open up to ideas from the outside and not to repeat mistakes. Okay, the second thing I like to talk about here would be with respect to some events that are negative events in your career. Especially when for older candidates, I found it's more common that they have some events they're having a hard time communicating in job interviews. For example, I had someone who booked a coaching session with me for this precise purpose. They had a conflict inside the organization, and they were eventually pushed out of the organization due to that conflict. And they did not know how to communicate that in a job interview. So this was a couple of years ago. And basically, I did my best. I tried to reward the answer. I tried to make it a bit sound more positive. I tried to, added some metrics. I tried everything I could during that 1 hour coaching session. And I basically wasted that person's time because I couldn't say, I didn't know to advise them that, hey, you know what? Don't use stories you cannot get over with in job interviews. So in retrospect, I always tell people, like if you had some very negative events as of recently and you got laid off, maybe don't share that in a job interview, because that will not convey necessarily a message of positivity or learning. And the definition of behavioral interviews, that they look at your past experiences as a predictor of success in your future role, whereas if you just got fired because you did a mistake, that's not a great an indication of a good performing candidate, right? So don't use stories that you cannot get over with in job interviews, okay? And the third thing I like to talk about here is something that I noticed on my website. You can add your stories and you can essentially build a story bank. And as you would expect with the generalization of AI, more and more candidates use AI extensively to interview prep. Okay, and I would say specifically for older candidates, they're as same, if not more, likely than younger candidates to use AI to prep job interviews. In my experience, this rarely ends up well. In fact, I'm going as far as to keep my notes on paper, simply, to raise a bit of awareness that, hey, you know what, pen and paper still works to prepare job interviews. It's always worked and it's always gonna work, even though it may not be as engaging, as exciting, and so on and so forth. But you'll have to trust me on this one, that it's going on an AI detox might be surprisingly beneficial for so many of you, especially for the older candidates, which is the topic of today's video. So long story short, try out pen and paper. I think you will be amazed how quickly and about the results you're going to achieve from your interview prep, your listening skills, and all that stuff. Because in my opinion, this is a trend that not enough people are talking about. That it's really back to basics, so to speak, when performing. Right? You should avoid all the fluff stuff. You should basically start thinking on your feet, less on cosmetics, less on AI, less on, on storytelling. Storytelling doesn't really work. It never really worked in interviews with high-performing companies, but nowadays it's very accessible to rebuild your stories as a storyteller. It's very much a factual-based interviews, and you have to be down to earth and think on your feet. I believe is the best way to sum it up. Right, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.